morning or afternoon to everyone, depending upon where you are in the country or in the world. My name is Edward Jones. I'm Director of Programs for AFSI, a Philanthropic Partnership for Black Communities. And I just want to say welcome to you. Thank you for joining this conversation. It's a really important conversation that we're going to host today. I also want to give a special thanks to our co-hosts for today, including Black Social Change Funders Network, Cities United, and Funders for Justice. This really important conversation on policing Blackness was actually conceived before we got to the most recent incidents in Milwaukee and other parts of the world. And so we want everyone to be engaged, and we want you to be informed, and we want to use this as a continuing conversation. But as part of this call that we're on right now, I just want to give you a couple of reminders. The phones are all muted during the webinar in order to prevent any outside or other distractions. We will definitely field questions later in the conversation. And to that end, we want to just invite you to post those questions when the question hits your thinking or somewhere along the way. In the right side, you'll see our control panel that actually allows you to post questions. And so feel free to use that as your opportunity to pose the questions throughout the conversation. We want you to join the conversation as well. We do have some hashtags that you should be mindful of, such as AFSI's hashtag, or AFSI's Twitter handle, Black Social Change, Cities United, Funders for Justice, and then also the conversation topic, which is on policing Blackness. We also want to invite you to join us on LinkedIn and Facebook and share resources and thoughts that you have along the way. Allow me to share and open up the conversation by introducing you to our moderator, Alvin Starks.
Thank you, Edward, and welcome everyone. I must admit, we are excited about today's conversation, partly because the issue of Black communities and law enforcement has really risen to an all-time high as an issue for most of us, be it that we're in our family rooms or in the workplace or as we watch the news or even consider the political debates that are currently happening. This conversation is a continuum of a larger systemic issue that I think we're just going to have the chance to just scratch on. But nonetheless, we want to be responsible as funders to provide a space for us to really think about these issues. The previous image, I Can't Breathe, really has become a bit of a part of our pop culture slogan to kind of understand what the exchange and the relationship of Black communities and policing is starting to look like. My name is Alvin Starks, and I have the privilege of being the moderator for this evening, or this afternoon, I should say. I'm currently at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. I am the incoming program officer for racial justice at the Open Society Foundations. Next slide, please. And I have been with the AFSI for several series over the last 2 years, I must admit, looking at issues of progressive activism in Black communities. Just to give us a sense of today's conversation, we're going to start off with a welcome and an overview, then followed by some extraordinary webinar presentations from our guest panelists, who I think you will absolutely enjoy speaking to and hearing from. Then followed by a Q&A with the panel. So as Edward reminded us, let's be mindful to kind of submit questions in the data bank, just so we can actually have those queued up. And then we'll have some closing comments. And of course, the closing comments will include, ideas, next steps, and things of that nature. Next slide. What's been very interesting about this moment is that it has produced, very similar to the civil rights movement as well, iconic images. This is one that's recent from Baton Rouge, and it's a 28-year-old nurse, and it probably will eventually win several photography awards because it's beginning to kind of tell us a story about where Black communities are. She's looking very much like a goddess, being threatened by this police force in military gear, and that's not generally how we think of the military. Here she is in a very peaceful presentation and being possibly arrested nonetheless. Next slide, please. I think the space of criminal justice is beginning to tell a larger narrative about the contemporary racial disparities that Americans are starting to see experienced by Black communities and their relationship with criminal justice systems. Undeniably, over the last 3 years, the issues facing Black communities around social justice and policing have been at the headline of many of the news outlets and has generated polarizing political debates. Next slide, please. More so than ever, these complex relationships between Black communities and creating police accountability are starting to get some momentum, but we still don't know exactly what to do. But nonetheless, we know we must address them. So for us as funders, the question really has become, well, what do we do? Where do we go from here? This is another picture of DeRay McKinson, who many of you know, part of the Black Lives Matter movement, and the t-shirt Stay Woke, hashtag Stay Woke, which in of itself is really meant to encourage literacy around how people understand Black liberation movements. Next slide, please. Systemically, issues of police accountability are not new, but we have to realize that the current social justice movements and social media have really spotlighted and amplified these realities to the forefront of the media. And so it's really not that we've discovered a new phenomena, but we now have new instruments that have actually moved these conversations to the forefront. In fact, this is a long-term civil rights issue. Next slide, please, around addressing police misconduct. If you know anything about like Jacob Lawrence, for instance, his Great Black Migration series actually had several panels that really talked about police brutality in Black communities. The migration series begins to kind of open up a conversation of Southern migrants coming north for an urban oasis, but then being met by a force field of police activity that they hadn't thought of before. Next slide. Just to kind of really show this kind of arc, this narrative historical arc. The recent tragedies in Baton Rouge, Dallas, Milwaukee, and Chicago, and many other cities, they further illustrate that there is a desperate need to have this conversation. When we look at the Milwaukee uprising and riots, which are very dramatic, they begin to kind of tell a different narrative about folks who are completely frustrated with their current policing situation. Next slide. But even from this conversation, there have been several new developments just in the last 2 weeks that I think are worth highlighting and just to kind of have in our thought bank as we have this conversation. So recently, the DOJ released a scathing report on the Baltimore Police Department's systemic targeting of African American communities, which really, I think, it's not that it's just Baltimore, but it's possibly other urban environments that are also systemically targeting these communities. The Milwaukee riots, as I mentioned earlier, they begin to illustrate this larger conversation or this frustration that individuals feel about their basic human rights and civil rights being eroded. Recently, I want to say this week, in fact, the Boston Police Department is starting to require body cameras on its officers after it failed to really get volunteers for that initiative. But it really is meant to really have law enforcement watched as they actually police various neighborhoods. And then in a larger political narrative, we're really seeing this question of Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter as an attempt to really discredit the human rights interests of the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's been highly politicized and has actually become part of the political discourse as individuals run for president. Next slide, please. So it's more than just a frustration that individuals are feeling and really sensing, but really a question that is very real. Next slide. So when we ask individuals about their notions of racial progress, a recent report that was done by Pew Research Center really illustrates that the nation is somewhat frustrated and maybe even a little concerned about how racial progress will be made. And the backdrop that many of them are looking at are the issues of policing, which again identifies this notion of progress, justice, and fairness. Next slide. So there was a question that was done around the perceptions of actually how Blacks are treated in the U.S. And it looked at issues like policing, the courts, workplace, restaurants. And as you can see on this, 84% of blacks said that they're mistreated by the police, whereas only 50% of whites said that. Those are very stark realities. And then if you follow that through, the courts are 75%, mortgage loans 66, workplace 64, restaurants 49, and voting 43. So people are very much aware. This was done, I want to say, in July of this calendar year. So it's not that old, but it begins to paint a picture around where we are. And not surprising, the issue of dealing with the police rang as the highest space of where black communities saw the highest level of mistreatment. Next slide. So what are we doing with this webinar? Well, this webinar is really meant to crack open a window, to create some space for conversation around what communities are doing, what funders are doing, how do we really create spaces for individuals to be heard, how does equity sort of ensue in this current moment, as well as I think this is a space for us to really think about some new ideas, to gain some histories, to gain some strategies for this long-term social progress. Next slide. I should mention that AbbVie has really decided that this is one of the issues that they want to focus on, so this will be one of a series that we will look at for the upcoming years around the intersection of black communities and criminal justice. But essentially, this conversation is really meant to engage the funders on this panel, but also to really understand where the dynamics around policing versus black communities mutually exist. When we talk about safety, whose human rights are really informing our strategies. Next slide. So we have brought together some leading thinkers who I think you will absolutely love to hear from. Next slide. On this call, we have Latasha Brown, Project Director for Grantmakers for Southern Progress, Nkechi Taifa, Advocacy Director for Criminal Justice at Open Society Policy Center, and Anthony D. Smith, Executive Director of Cities United. So next slide. I would like to introduce our panel. Each one will speak for about 10 minutes or so, and you will have a chance to really, again, enter questions on the Q bar. Next slide. So I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Latasha Brown, Project Director for Grantmakers for Southern Progress. Latasha, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you, Alvin.
Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome. Thanks to everybody that's listening. Next slide, please. I am the Director of Grantmakers for Southern Progress. Next slide. And we are a network of Southern and regional and national funders who are working together to address structural change in the U.S. South. Next slide. Just want to give some context. So, in thinking about this topic around policing blackness, I thought it would be really important to give some context around kind of the origins of policing in America, but particularly in looking at a snapshot of the American South, which is really kind of the foundation of policing in this country. It was in 1704, and the nation had its first slave patrol. So there had been an uprising in Stono, in South Carolina in 1739, an uprising of about 60 slaves who actually led to the killing of roughly around almost 24 whites. And as a response to that, immediately there were slave codes that were put in place and what was called paddy patrols. So even the foundation prior to that, there had not been a policing unit, there had not been there wasn't a law enforcement system, but what was created was this system that was led in terms of paddy controls for slaves. And what we saw is a proliferation of that throughout the South. And we even saw but it wasn't just in the South that we saw that. We also, in St. Louis, the police department in St. Louis was actually founded to protect white residents of Native Americans. From Native Americans as they saw themselves as a frontier city. There's also examples in northern New York where there were patrols that were set up to control, quote, control Native Americans in that area. So in that context, what we see is there was not a legally sanctioned law enforcement system that applied to white people or white men until after the Civil War. But prior to that, the system, what you saw, and I know you saw sheriffs, you even saw bounty hunters. Crime, it was dealt with like an incident by incident. In terms of white crime, was dealt like an incident by incident. But what we saw coming out of slavery is you saw this system being developed that really has led to the foundation of the criminal system in this country. There's a quote that I listed, that policing in this country has always had a dual purpose in maintaining the social order and forcing of racial hierarchy, by William Geller. Slide, please. I think it's really important for us to really have kind of context of the origins of policing in this country, that the very foundation of the creation of the system was designed to control and manage and suppress people of color. So it has always been a tool by the state and sanctioned by the state to suppress people of color. Because of that, there's always been this deep-seated history of deep fear and distrust with law enforcement and communities of color. And a core piece of that, as we know, of the examples of the Native Americans, of Mexicans in the frontier of what we know now as Texas, and what we saw in the American South with slaves, there was a core part of the system, defining element of the system was based in a racial context. And another interesting thing, and I think we continue to see that in the narrative around policing, there was this concept that policing kind of grew out of this idea of this perceived threat by whites, that Black people and people of color would uprise and somehow shift the social order. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So I think that's important for a number of reasons. One, I think it's really important that we look at this issue, and we look at the issue of policing with this background and this context, to understand that this is a structural and systemic issue. When we look at television and when we look at these incidents, what winds up happening, it becomes like this incident by incident, as if they're isolated incidents, as if the Michael Brown is an isolated incident, as if the Jordan is an isolated incident, and not necessarily look in the context that this comes out of a larger structural and systemic issue. And in the context, when you think about systems will function as a system is designed to function. So if the foundation of criminal justice, of this criminal justice law enforcement system, was created in the context of suppressing and controlling people of color, it continues to function in that way. And I think we have to look, it's really important that we have an analysis, that we're looking at it from this structural context, so that we don't seek to address it just in an isolated, or even as if it's a modern day, there's a modern day occurrence that happened. What's interesting is when Alvin was sharing, he shared the picture about Jacob Lawrence and what happened with the migration, and as people went to urban areas, there was a certain kind of context in which people were dealing with law enforcement, but there was a foundation, a previous piece in terms of that was laid in this country that actually started from the slave patrols, and that was designed intentionally to suppress people of color. I think the second thing that's really important for us to look at is the intersectional frame, that while there is this social kind of context that we're looking at, policing and Blackness and race, there's also a political and economic implications along with that. For example, many what we know as prisons now, that immediately during slavery, during the slave trade, when there were excess slaves that could not be sold, there were prisons that were holding cells. They didn't call them holding cells, they actually called them slave prisons. And as a result, even when you look at the French market in New Orleans, there was an entire economic industry that was created out of that, from tailors to the people who provided the food. So there's some economic tie-ins to, as we're looking at the criminalization of what's happening in the community and the policing of Blackness in this country. There's been an economic benefit for those who have a benefit for those who perpetuate this system. I think it's really important for us to look at this in an intersectional way and not necessarily just from the social context, but also what the political and the economic implications have been. And then the third piece that I will raise is around looking at community as a resource for solutions. An example of that is in many areas, particularly in the Deep South, where there was this onslaught of incidents happening between the police abusing its authority. We saw it in the civil rights movement. We saw it abusing their authority. There were African American communities, people, organizers in communities that got together in places like Alabama and Mississippi and decided to intentionally go after the sheriff's office. That the most important seat for that particular area, that county, one, to address with the policing issue, but two, to also, they understood kind of the context of how the policing of communities impacted other areas as well, and those communities actually organized, and there you can see, particularly in the 70s and the 80s, in the mid 80s, you can see the shift of where DAs, and particularly in the Deep South, where you see sheriffs and sheriff offices, that there was a shift in that. Slide, please. Slide. Can you change slide, please? So as I kind of wrap up, what we saw with Grantmakers for Southern Progress actually did a report called As the South Goes 5 years ago. And in that, what we discovered in that process is that we actually interviewed funders, national funders and regional funders, and national social justice funders what we discovered through that process, through that research, tended to focus more on kind of narrow band of strategies like organizing, civic engagement, and advocacy and movement building work. Social change funders saw supporting kind of a broader range of strategies that was systems level, and even in the from social services to community economic development, because it is so ingrained, even when we're looking at the formation of these systems like the criminal justice system in the South and throughout the country. It's integrated in all the other systems in these communities, including who has political power, who has economic power and economic access. I will stop right now because of my time, and then just be open and interested in joining in conversation. Thank you.
Latasha, thank you so much, and I've jotted down like a gazillion questions because I definitely want to come back to so many things that you mentioned, and thank you for giving us the historical context, because I think that's the right way to start this conversation, and then the intersectional frames were absolutely brilliant, so thank you. I also want to bring up Nkechi Taifa, who is the Advocacy Criminal Justice Director at the Open Society Policy Center in D.C. Nkechi, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Alvin.
Okay.
How are you?
Thank you. Very well. Take it, Nkechi.
Looking forward to you being my colleague very soon.
Same here.
Announcement, right?
Okay, we can go ahead and start with the slides. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so about a year ago, my policy associate wrote a blog that was published in the Open Society Voices, and it was entitled, I Am Sandra Bland, and it was her personal realization that because of the hue of her skin, that there is an increased possibility that during a police encounter, she could become the next hashtag or victim scrolling across the banner of CNN. She stated that she fears any interaction with police because there is not an outfit, a college degree, a job title, or even a law that could protect her. She states that these never-ending incidences of police violence remind her that in our criminal justice system, her life is no more valuable than the pack of CDs Alton Sterling was carrying or the bag of Skittles that Trayvon Martin was carrying. She said that she or any of us could be Sandra Bland, the African-American woman who mysteriously died in police custody after asserting her rights after an illegal stop of her vehicle. The lengthy history of police violence against people of color is legion. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division receives over 8,000 complaints each year, with 75 to 85% of them involving problems with the police. And guess what? Most of these allegations are made by persons of color. Next slide, please. So year after year, decade after decade, century after century, although the players change and although the scene shifts, the script irrefutably remains the same: unequal justice. It doesn't matter whether the issue is vigilantism or police brutality, prosecutorial abuse, or unjust sentencing. As a race, Black people have been subjected to a double standard of justice. Doesn't matter if we're talking about Fred Hampton and Mark Clark of the Black Panther Party murdered by police in their beds in 1969. Doesn't matter if we're talking about Abner Louima viciously sodomized by police at a police station, the 41 shots pummeled into Amadou Diallo by officers who claimed they could not tell the difference between a cell phone and a gun. Eleanor Bumpers murdered in her home for resisting an eviction. Oscar Grant dead on the BART platform on New Year's Eve. Sean Bell murdered by police on his wedding day. Next slide. The difference between police violence against Blacks of yesterday and that of today can be seen in those 81 seconds of videotape filmed by a private citizen of the vicious beating of Rodney King, which brought into national focus the blatant police brutality that is a tragic part of the African-American experience, and it ushered in the genesis of this modern era that we are experiencing right now. Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Ayanna Jones, Orlando Castile, police violence against Black teens at a Texas pool party. Most recently, Sybil Smith in Milwaukee. And I think I just saw something across my screen about another shooting in Chicago just today or yesterday or something along those lines. The list is endless, and unfortunately, it continues unabated. As funders, we need to understand, we need to really look at the variety of factors that contribute to this whole problem of police violence, some of which include increased militarization of local law enforcement, unfettered police discretion, the infamous police code of silence, inadequate disciplinary measures by police departments and administrators, and the ineffectiveness of current remedies. Next slide, please. So we want to look at militarization as expressed in a recent ACLU report. Quote, the images on the news of police wearing helmets and masks, toting assault rifles, riding in mine-resistant armored vehicles, they are not isolated incidents. They represent a nationwide trend of police militarization. Federal programs providing surplus military equipment, along with departments' own purchases, have outfitted officers with firepower that is often far, far, far beyond what is necessary for their jobs as protectors of their communities. Sending a heavily armed team of officers to perform, quote unquote, normal police work can dangerously and has dangerously escalated situations that need never have involved violence in the first place. And the change in equipment is too often paralleled by a corresponding change in attitude whereby police conceive of themselves as, quote unquote, at war with our communities rather than as public servants concerned with keeping the communities safe. Let's take a look at discretion. Police discretion allows officers to determine in what manner they will enforce the law. There was a verbatim transmission from an LAPD mobile digital terminal, which I feel is indicative of the amount of discretion one officer felt that he had. He's recorded as saying, quote, they give me a stick, they give me a gun, they pay me 50 G's to have some fun. You see, police officers on the street tend to exercise the most discretion because, ironically, as one moves down the police hierarchy, discretion increases. There's something wrong with that scenario. I want to repeat that. As one moves down the police hierarchy, discretion increases, which means the cop on the beat, the cop on the street, the lowest person on the totem pole has all of the discretion in the world, but they don't have the requisite training that goes along with the responsible use of that discretion. This unchecked discretion is evident by the disproportionate numbers of Black and other people of color that are arrested, assaulted, and killed by police, despite the fact that the quantity of crimes committed by whites is similar. So let's take a look right now at the gross abuse of discretion, which leads to the infamous code of silence. This code of silence is often used to cover up abusive and unlawful behavior, and it's a strong contributor to the problem of police use of deadly and excessive force. The code of silence is an unwritten loyalty oath among police officers, which prohibits an officer from reporting incriminating information about a fellow police officer. You see, police officers are apprehensive about violating this code and disclose unlawful behavior of their peers because they might then become targets of harassment, ostracism, or abandonment by other officers in the street when they are in need of assistance. You see, police won't tattle on each other given this stringent code of silence, and district attorneys are reluctant to indict officers because they depend on these same police to handle their criminal investigations. All of this allows rampant police brutality and abuse to continue, with officers openly abusing and killing Blacks without fear of reprisal. Another problem is the inadequacy of current disciplinary measures. Many police departments fail to discipline an officer that has received numerous complaints or has been charged with excessive use of force. Some officers even receive promotions despite numerous complaints of excessive force and brutality that have been documented against them. But if police are not appropriately disciplined for unlawful conduct, they will not have the motivation to cease from that unlawful conduct. And even where discipline is imposed, it is often minimum at best. For example, in New York City, when officers are found guilty of using excessive force, the penalty many receive is a 1-week suspension. This is the same punishment given to an officer who accepts 2 free donuts from a restaurant, or who wears a turtleneck while in uniform, or is discourteous to a supervisor. There's also an ineffectiveness of current remedies. The main instrument in federal law for seeking redress from police misconduct have been civil rights damage actions brought pursuant to 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. Twin purposes underlie this provision. The first is to offer victims of police abuse some form of compensation. The second is to ensure that police officers and departments are held accountable to constitutionally required standards of conduct. Yet the effectiveness of such lawsuits has been limited. There are also practical limitations. First, instead of remedying police abuse within the department, municipal leaders may simply pay the cost of damage awards. Second, there is no incentive for the police to change, since when they are found liable, they are rarely personally exposed to liability. Next slide. The meme in this next slide basically speaks to itself in terms of the disparities. Unwarranted, totally unwarranted beating of a child by an NFL player versus the murder of a child by a white police officer. The disparities in punishment are stark. Next slide, please. So we want to look at some solutions. As funders, we must stress to our grantees, we need to make sure that they're looking at some of these issues. Improvement of data collection and reporting. This is one key way to increase transparency about police encounters and help identify disparate profiling, use of force, police-involved killings, there's a national database for cops killed in the line of duty. If Black lives truly matter, then such deaths, especially at the hands of police, should be accurately counted and thoroughly documented. Professor Phil Goff has been doing a whole lot in this arena. There must be a demilitarization of domestic law enforcement. Deadly force must not be the first response, particularly when the suspects are unarmed. There must be use of the least restrictive alternative as the first consideration. What happened to the tasers? What happened to the stun guns? Yes, those can be deadly as well, but when firearms is used as the first response, that automatically just always results in death. Officer accountability. There's currently no centralized system that tracks an officer's history of misconduct. As a result, police who receive disciplinary action, including demotion, suspension, or dismissal, are often hired to be police officers in other jurisdictions without having to disclose their history of misconduct. That must not be allowed to continue. We need strong, independent civilian review of police departments. Accountability can also include annual police conduct checks to ensure that the officer's history of conduct has not changed or that the conduct is addressed with the necessary training in or disciplinary action. Additionally, we should stress that officers be required to purchase individual officer liability insurance. You see, when police departments get sued for misconduct, particularly wrongful death suits, cities settle with the families at the expense of its taxpayers. In Minneapolis, activists are working on a ballot initiative that will require officers to carry professional liability insurance as a condition of employment. The city will cover basic insurance, but premiums would increase each time officers are involved in misconduct. And these premiums would be at the officer's responsibility. Adherence to international standards. International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination stresses the right to security of person and protection by the state against violence or bodily harm, whether inflicted by government officials or by any individual, group, or institution. That convention is called CERD. CERD also allows claims to be actionable if there is discriminatory impact, even if one cannot prove discriminatory intent. This is major. There are also important international standards governing the use of force that should be adhered to. Implementation of action items from the pillars of the President's 21st Century Task Force on Policing could also help to alleviate many of the issues I've raised in this presentation. Those pillars from the President's Task Force focus on building trust and legitimacy, policy and oversight, technology and social media, community policing and crime reduction, training and education, and officer wellness and safety. Finally, Congress serves an important function in building trust and legitimacy between law enforcement and the communities they serve. The federal government annually provides billions of dollars in resources to law enforcement and the criminal justice system. There must be accountability and oversight of these dollars. And while we recognize that policing must reflect the diverse needs and interests of the nation's communities, uniformity is needed for certain policing strategies to bring an end to police violence. We submit that what we need is a police reform policy campaign to ensure that there is comprehensive federal reform, oversight, and accountability with respect to policing. Although there are pieces of reform legislation pending, there's not any one bill that addresses the numerous areas in which reform is needed, including accreditation, cameras, data, diversion, force, forfeiture, funding, grand juries, guns, health, hiring, investigations, litigation, militarization, profiling, prosecutors, training, and unions. In conclusion, as depicted the graphic on the side of the page, the disproportionate damaging effect of unconstitutional policing in Black communities is a grim reality that impacts generations. The Black father, after seeing the headline, "Another Black man shot," is worried about his son. And the son in that graphic is worrying about his father. As funders, we need to really look at some of these root causes. We need to turn the mourning that our communities are experiencing into movement, and we need to turn the sorrow that we all feel into strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nkechi, and I love that phrase, turning the mourning into movement. I have plenty of questions for you too. Thank you for that presentation, and I also want to give you shout outs for actually coming with solutions as well, because I think that actually helps our own thinking in this conversation. Next, I would like to bring up Anthony D. Smith, Executive Director at Cities United. Anthony, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thanks, Alvin. How are you?
Perfect. Very well. Take it away, Anthony.
Good. First, I want to thank you and Edward and Athby for really pulling this together and inviting Cities United to be a part of call, because it's very important for us in the work that we do every day. So what I want to do first is just give folks just a little bit of background of Cities United, and then talk a little bit about broader policies other than just the police that really police Blackness in this community. So just a little bit about Cities United on the next slide, please. So Cities United is a national mayor-led initiative, and we have mayors in 86 cities who are working with community members, faith community, philanthropy, and trying to build a network, a system of mayors across the country working on the ground level to really look at how do we reduce the homicide rate of African-American men and boys by the year 2025 by 50%. Our goal is to work with 500 mayors over the next 8 years and really push them to look at policies and the systems to make it different so that we can get better outcomes for our Black men and boys, their families, and their communities that they live in. We're really focused on this issue because if you look at the data, we know that that's the second to first, depending on where you are, way that we lose Black men and boys. And when you think about this context, also at law enforcement's hands as well. So we want to make sure that we're constantly having these conversations around what can we do differently. But we start our conversation with the mayor and their chiefs because we know they have access to budgets and policies that can have an impact on people's lives moving forward. Cities United was launched in 2011 under the leadership of Michael Nutter, who was the mayor of Philadelphia, Mayor Landrieu, New Orleans, Dr. William Bell from Casey Family Programs, he's the CEO and president, Sean Dove, who's the CEO of the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, and then also the National League of Cities. We are in the process of taking it from an initiative to an organization and really building out what this looks like. We push the mayors and their teams to really be committed to restoring hope for their communities and also building pathways to justice, employment, education, and increased opportunities. So when we think about this, next slide, please. We look at our work and push mayors to work inside of these 5 sectors. And this 5-sector model comes from Dr. Bell and the Casey Family Programs. And when you look at these, and this is how I really want to frame my conversation with you all when we think about this, is that, when you look at these 5 sectors and you look at them in a way, Black boys and girls and Black communities have been policed before we even hit the scene. And it's regulated on a number of different things, and it's looked at, and folks are dictated where they can live, where they work, and a lot of different things that take place. So when we look at these 5 sectors, we're looking at them in a way of saying to folks, I think to the earlier presenters, they talked a lot about systemic racism and breaking down structural racism, and this is where all of this stuff takes place, and really looking at how do we get in there and how do we move those policies and procedures to be different. And I want to just highlight a couple of things that I think really starts before we even get into a relationship with police, even though they're there. I think it really starts with how a lot of Black folks and brown folks are actually regulated and where they can live. And police where we house, not only where we house, but where we can live, but also who can live with us based on policies and procedures that have been put in place because people thought it was in their best interest for us to live in certain places and be in certain places. But then also to think about when you see folks proposing policies to say, let's drug test folks before they can live here. Those who, if you have a felon, you can't go live back with your mom or your wife or your girlfriend. And so all of those things dictate how kids are seen and policed and where we live and how we actually live our lives. And then when you think about that, right, you start with the police and where we live and how we live and who we live with. That also goes to where we go to school, where our kids end up at schools, which schools did they go to and what happens to them in those schools. And when you look at the data, the data is clear that with disproportionality, our kids are not faring well in school, and they're being disciplined and they're being pushed out. So when you look at all of these things, so I just want to continue to think about policing a little bit broader, not just law enforcement and the criminal justice system, but what is it about the policies that actually police a lot of our lives and what we have access to and don't have access to. So when you think about the school system, I am one who actually felt that the school system never wanted me there. You get to a place where you feel like you've been pushed out. They're not trying to figure out how to make it better for you. And I think that starts with housing, but then it also goes into the school system, and our kids are being pushed out at an early age. When you can look at the data and seeing how many young kids, especially young boys, have been suspended at kindergarten from school. And the data also shows the more times you're suspended, the less likely you are to graduate. Then that leads you into different lifestyles that then leads you into having this kind of relationship with the law enforcement, whether warned or not warned, you run into this lifestyle. And then, looking at, that ideal of being pushed out of school, locked out of a quality education leads you to limited access to employment. And then also who is there to make the call of who gets hired and who doesn't get hired. And I think a lot of that also limits the access to opportunities for our folks as they trying to move up the ladder and get to different places. So, when I think about police and Blackness, the first thing that popped into my head as we think about Cities United and we think about these 5 sectors is that there's a number of ways that we are policed as a community that does not include law enforcement up front, even though it plays a huge role in its taking lives. There's also these other ways that we have been locked out of the system and policed to be in certain ways. And then the last thing that I will leave us with is that we also need to think about, when we think about the public health approach to the work that we do, when you see what's happening now with the heroin epidemic, which I think is a great thing that we're looking at it from a public health approach. We're saying these folks are addicted to it. Let's get them help. Let's not criminalize them. And one of the things that I continually to push back on is to ask people to think about what would the Black community look like today if we did the same thing with the crack epidemic, where we were not locking up mamas and grandmothers because they were addicted, but we really looked at that and said we need to get them help so that we can keep these families together, so we can figure out how we as a community can take care of them during this time, because this is an addiction. It's not a crime. It's not a crime to be an addict, and we treated it that way. So I think, when we think about policing our communities, it's got to be on a broader term. And I think it said a couple of times earlier that we've got to look at root causes. We got to think about this as systems change. We've got to think about the systemic racism that's taking place and really put forth solutions and ideas that are going to have long-term impacts on our community and not just focus on one part of it, but it's a whole conversation. And I think that's where we as Cities United are really doing, is trying to say to mayors on a local level, we need you to really pull a table of folks together that come from all of these different sectors, while you're also creating a national network where we can talk to folks on the national level too, where we can engage the federal government and really push them to make things differently so that we can create the safe, healthy, and hopeful communities that we all want and need for our families to live out their dreams. So I will leave it there and be ready for Q&A.
Anthony, that was great. Thank you so much. And also, I really appreciated your ability to remind us to think differently and deeply about policing beyond the notion of an organized unit, but that Black communities are oftentimes policed prior to any formal engagement with the criminal justice infrastructure. So I appreciate that. Also, for folks on the call, if you have questions, please do enter them into the data board, and we will ask those as soon as we have a follow-up with another presenter, which we're pleased to have, Mr. Brandon Anderson, who is going to join us to also share some information. Brandon is from the SWAT app. Brandon, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep. So, Brandon, why don't you give us your presentation? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks. I really appreciate the work that everyone's been doing and the presentation thus far. I'll tell you a little bit about me, just a quick background, and then the project that I'm working on I'm a former U.S. Army satellite engineer. I spent 5 years in the military overseas, and I've learned very heavily about how technology and data can be used to make real-world decisions and inform best practices. And I'm really sort of engaged in this work through a connection that goes simply beyond my technology. My best friend and lifetime partner in 2007 was killed while I was in the military by the Oklahoma City Police Department. And those two people, or two officers who killed him, still live on the force, still work on the force. And so the work that I do is very much important to me and very close to me personally. I'll tell you a little bit about the project. It's fairly simple. We are building an application that allows citizens to rate the performance and experience that they have with police officers after the experience. That information is then aggregated and anonymized in a database that allows us to measure the impact that policing has on every individual, regardless of skin color, regardless of mental challenge, regardless of location. And so at the end, what you basically have is a mapping, an interactive mapping system by which we are able to more effectively measure the well-being of communities. And we do that because you're able to track both the location, you're able to track the frequency of incidents, the demographics of each incident, both officers involved. And so that's really a way for us to inform best practices through policy. It's also a way for us to become more engaged when we talk about the ideas of getting social services engaged in the ways by which policing happens. This is one way to find out where those locations need to exist. And so we've had a lot of early success with it through piloting it in certain parts of the country. And really where we are with the project now is moving on some artificial intelligence and understanding how to predict police behavior in particular areas so as to prevent that, is to sort of create institutional policies that allow for such thing. So I'll leave it there. I want to keep it short and brief, but I'd love to engage anyone who's on the call who's interested in sort of in any questions that they might have. I'd love to answer.
Brendan, I really appreciate that because your presentation really does a nice bookend to the earlier conversations of actually the roots of actually where policing comes from. And so this is yet another example of where the innovation of solutions could really change the conversation. So what I want to do before we open it up to the larger audience is have a conversation amongst the panel. You guys gave very detailed conversations for us to really think about. And one thing that I was really struck by is that as you were speaking, it felt like, policing and criminal experiences are really the culmination of larger social inequities, larger intersectional inequities. And so with that in mind, I was really curious to hear about how much of this issue of policing is just the reality of racism versus this notion of implicit bias. So there's been a lot of work being done respectfully around what happens when people see, in particular, Black people, that actually changes the temperature of actually how they engage with them, especially when they are in a power seat. But the presentations also open up another really important part, that this is a larger conversation about racism in America. So with that in mind, I'm really curious to know, what are your thoughts? Like, is this really just policing gone wrong, or is this a larger race project in democracy?
This is Nikki. I definitely think it is a larger issue in society, and it is most graphically seen with respect to police because they wield huge power. But it's across the board, the issues dealing with implicit bias, and we didn't really have a name for it before. We just knew that there was something wrong or something different in terms of perceptions when it came to the darker hue. In fact, Congresswoman Maxine Waters once said in relation to law enforcement, she said the bigger and blacker you are, the more likely you are to experience abuse at the hands of law enforcement. So again, that goes again into the issue of race, but it's not just limited to law enforcement. Let me let someone else jump in.
This is Latasha. Something that I failed to mention is when the slave patrols were happening because I think it's really important, reason why I wanted to share the context is that somehow it seems like there's this thought that something went wrong with the police, that there was the police, and yeah, there's been like this history, this struggle and history between Black people and the police, but really not a full acknowledgement that the police infrastructure itself was created for the sole purpose of policing and for controlling people of color, that the very system, that was the nature of the design of the system. And I shared that one of the pieces that I failed to mention was that when the slave patrols were happening in the South, that all white males, not a particular police force, but all white males from the age of 6 years old to 60 were required to serve, to volunteer on those patrols. So they just would rotate it. So even in that context, there was a particular context that said the white community had authority, and that the white community itself did not need to be policed, but that the white community had authority to police the African American, the Black community. The significance of that is I think that we have to look at this not in the context of reformists, just how do we reform the police department, but if we really are to look at criminal justice, we've got to really look at the roots of the whole systemic, the structure, how it was created for a particular purpose, and that what we see is it may have changed or shift over the years, but there was a particular purpose that system was put in place, and it was designed for the control and management of people of color. There's incidents of Native Americans. There's incidents of so I'm raising that in the context because I think it's important for us to see that it's not that there's some system and somehow it's gotten infected with racial injustice, but the very nature of the creation and the design of the system had a particular was created out of a particular racial context.
Yeah, thank you, Latasha. As someone, I really appreciate the historical literacy, and I know we have several questions coming up in the queue, so I want to turn it over. Oh, go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, I'm sorry, because I think, part of it, when we talk about systems and we talk about racism, I think you've also got to think about how the system changed people as they go into it. Not saying that people, because I think sometimes we got folks of color who are in the system who act just like anybody else in the system and perpetrate injustice on other people of color, right? So I think if you think about what happened in Milwaukee, it was a Black cop who shot this young Black man, right? And I think so sometimes, so I just want to just put that out there, that I think the system, and when you're a part of a system that is structural, that has a structural racism and implicit bias, sometimes you become a part of that as you maneuver through it. Because also when you think about school systems and that we are also suspended and expelled by folks who look like us as well. So I just want to add that piece to your question around, the structural racism is also it changes, or it might not change it might bring it out. I don't know what you want to call it, but also people buy into it when they're in it. And I think part of the issue is that the system is so I think to the point that it's doing what it was designed to do, and it's not just the police system, but it's other systems that we're a part of that also hinders our lives like that. So.
But Anthony, before you go, I wanted to ask you something else, because in your presentation you talked about elected officials, right, as well as other civic agents. So in this conversation, what role, if any, do elected officials play in bringing remedy or bringing equity to this conversation?
So for me, I think they play a huge role, right? Because I think they set the tone for how things are going to be, how things are going to move forward, right? They set the tone to prevent these kind of things from happening, but they also set the tone of how you act when it happens, and then how you rebuild community trust afterwards, right? So I think one of the things police are doing, and I think somebody mentioned the president's 21st century policing, is that cities and mayors are actually going back through now, and because most mayors and most elected official mayors have authority of appointing and also helping the police department do the things that it needs to do. So I think elected officials have a huge stake in this around, we talk about when stuff is released, when stuff is not released, and then how do we be as transparent. And that's really on the mayor and the chief to really put that out. So for me, elected officials play a huge role of holding each other accountable, but then also making sure that it's a transparent process. But they also have, again, they have access to the resources. When you talk about policies and budgets, that's their job, is to make sure that those are spread out equitable amongst people. So they play a huge part for me.
So I know we have some questions in the queue, so I want to turn it over to Edward to share those with the panel. Edward?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thank you all for really providing some amazing and guidance on these topics. The first question actually does kind of shift a little bit from what Anthony was just talking about the roles and responsibilities of the elected officials. And that question is regarding for those funders on this call, particularly. The way it's framed is that knowing that some funders are very focused on issues and strategies of the year as opposed to a long-standing strategy oftentimes. And the question is, what do you have for how staff or consultants of foundations both raise the need for and support long-term strategies for building the infrastructure for social change in Black communities? That's the first question.
Well, let me just say, this is Nikichi, and let me just stress, I primarily work in Washington for the Open Society Policy Center, which is a policy arm of the Open Society Foundations. It's not the specific grant-making arm, but as most folks know, OSF has done a lot of grant-making in this area. One of the things I mentioned briefly was the work that Phil Goff was doing or is doing in areas of training and data collection, implicit bias, and the like. Many times funding happens as a result of an incident or, public outcry, et cetera, but the strategies within it are not just limited to that particular instance or scenario. They're far reaching and touch on many different areas. So that's what we hope we're doing with the funding that we have. I don't know how much more I should say about funding that comes out of New York that I'm not directly responsible for. But in Washington, we are looking at funding some type of comprehensive campaign that looks at federal dollars and federal system and what can be done to incentivize progressive actions on the state level, as well as federal interventions that can be made as well.
I'll just reiterate. Yep, just the idea of the long-term strategies. How do you encourage funders to support long-term strategies without cutting off short-term strategy work that's already underway in communities, as it relates to Black communities specifically?
So I'll just briefly share my thoughts. I mean, one, and I'm stressing it and will continue to stress it, I think that we have to look at this as a systemic, as a structural issue, and that because of that, you recognizing that communities are in protracted struggle. So here it is that we're fighting and coming up against systems that have been in place since the existence of people of color in this country. And I think it's really important that we look at this. We're in a marathon, not in a sprint. So while there are short-term objectives we have, and I know in terms of most foundation investments, our investments most of the time are 3 to 5 years, right? So, but looking at how those investments can be catalytic or actually be a component of kind of the long-term strategy as projected by a community, because at the end of the day, when our investment, we're no longer investing in those communities, they're still leading that work. And I think it's really important for us to look at investment in the sense of one really being in partnership with community and I think communities know their best approach. Like I used the example earlier where to deal with the police department that was actually a city department, people went after the sheriff, and they went after the sheriff not because of the policing on the front end. They went after the sheriff because the sheriff would run the elections. In the Black Belt, the sheriff actually controlled the elections, and they kept losing elections because there were this feeling that they were unfair, that they were stealing these elections, right? So that prevented the mayor from being selected, that prevented the police chief, on and on and on. The point is, I think that there are solutions in community when we're in relationship with community as we're doing our funding, and looking at this from what component that we can support, but that it is in alignment what the community has already identified as its core piece. I think that's really important. And I think the second point, is really important to really look at it from this structural frame, and not just in not just in a program, kind of by program piece. And I think the third piece I'll just share, the third piece that I'll say is it's really important to see it intersectionally as well, that we see the policing piece of, oftentimes the way that we do our work is within the context of whatever our portfolio is in the context of that particular piece. So you go to communities and say, well, we want to fund work around police brutality, right? And the community, while the community, that may not be the core need for that community, even though police brutality it may come off a different kind of way. It may look differently. For example, in Montgomery, Alabama, right outside in Wetumpka, Alabama, in the prisons, they're having when they see police brutality on the outside, there's a larger problem even within the prisons where the federal government had to come in and really address that. So I think it's really important as a core principle to be in partnership and alignment with community, understanding that we're dealing with structural systemic issues.
Yeah, this is Anthony, and I would agree 100% with that. And I think part of that conversation also, just again coming from Cities United point of view, is that how do you help the community and the mayors and other elected officials have that kind of conversation? Because part of this is around with foundations coming in, is how do you all come in partnership and together to help kind of stabilize the communities, right? Because I think part of it is that when you think about the communities that we all are talking about, the city budget is the city budget, and all of that stuff is what it is. But where are the gaps that people are calling for and need to be filled? And I think having funders come as a partnership with the folks on the ground, and then also the city folks, but also come in as a collective, right? Not just one funder trying to come in and do it all, but if you can come in and partner with the local foundations and then also some of the regional foundations to have that conversation. Because I think, to Latasha's point, is that you cannot do no one-offs. You cannot just come in and just have to take this program and run this program. It's got to be a well thought out, and again, it's got to be beyond the typical funding cycles that we are used to when you push this a little bit more. But I just think, you got to bridge some bridges, and I think sometimes foundations and folks like Cities United come in and can have those conversations because we're a little bit, we might be trusted a little bit more, we might be seen differently. But how do we use our voices to help build some bridges and break down some of the structural things? But then also, how do we help stabilize some of our communities that have been unstable for a long time?
Thank you for everyone. Let me ask a broader question. Actually, it has a couple of components to it. So as it relates to the work that we've been doing with the Black Social Change Funders Network, we're looking at Black philanthropy at AFI as the broader context. So that includes social groups, faith institutions, fraternities, sororities, and the like. And the question posed is, how might you suggest those types of entities get involved in increasing support to Black-led social change efforts in Black communities? That's the first part of the question.
Edward, it went out on my side. Can you just repeat that one more time?
I'm sorry. Okay. how might we engage other organizations, Black-led organizations such as fraternities, sororities, donors, foundations, Blacks in corporate spaces, even the faith community? How might we encourage them to increase their support to Black-led social change organizations?
Well, let me just say this. One thing that's critical is information. A lot of these groups don't have the information. I will say in terms of criminal justice reform, just generally speaking, it's only been very recently, within the past several years, that this issue, this very critical issue that disproportionately impacts communities of color, has become mainstream. So as a result, there really is a lack of knowledge amongst the general public and amongst these key constituency groups that you mentioned as well. To help to bridge part of that gap, I would like to invite people to visit the Justice Roundtable's website, www.justiceroundtable.org, which basically provides basic information on various issue areas of criminal justice reform, whether it's sentencing reform, law enforcement reform, prison reform, commutations and pardons, criminalization, and there might be several others, but just to provide a basic level of information so that people can take that information and then go forward to help to bring value to the movements that are going on. So I agree 100%. Many times we overlook the faith groups and the the fraternities and sororities. Sometimes we overlook celebrities, that are out there. But all of these are part of what encompasses a movement, and it's not just the experts, it's not just the people who are in the forefront of reform, but it needs to involve everyone.
Thank you.
And I think you got to be, and I think also, Edward, you just got to be intentional about inviting them to the table, right? Because traditionally, that's not who, when you think about the RFPs or whatever goes out, or people saying we got funding, that's not the typical groups that foundations go and fund and support, right? So I think if that's where we want to move to, you got to be real intentional about the outreach to them, and then also bringing them to the table and helping them get ready, or some might already be ready, but they might not have the infrastructure to do all the things that foundations need to take in the money and then also to report out on it. So I just think there's got to be a new system created if we really want to get to this place of movement building, as the last person just said, and really say to folks, come to the table so we can talk about what role you play, and then also understand what your needs and resources, what resources you need, so that we can help you find those. But I just don't think typically those folks have been invited to the table to apply for and to seek funding, because if you go, most of the guidelines don't say that's who you're looking for.
And the only thing, thank you, the only thing that I would add to that, I thank both of the previous speakers, the only thing that I would add to that is I think that funders in particular, I always see that there's value in supporting spaces. And so I do think it's really important when funders allow put resources aside for convening, so people can get together and relationship build. And it's through many of my relationships, much of my work that I've done throughout the years has come from being in its space and sharing space with folk, and in that gathering being able to build relationships and find commonalities. So I think it's really important that there is a power of convening that I do think that funders can certainly help with.
Very good, thank you. I'm posing this question to Anthony specifically, and then we'll come back to a broader question for the group. Anthony, can you speak to how the lack of proper training and continued professional development has an impact on police discretion? And I'll fold in for everyone else to weigh in on this. How might this fit in with the recent report that you all talked about a little bit regarding the Baltimore City Police Department? So talk about it from your perspective, Anthony, and then broaden the conversation around everyone's broader sentiments around that recent report, that scathing report that someone did speak about earlier.
Frame that question one more time for me, Edward, please.
Yeah, so the lack of proper training and continued professional development, how does that have an impact on the police discretion?
Yeah, so I think and I think you also got to throw in there the fact that, there's unions in place to also help advocate and support and push back on when there's certain trainings and stuff put forward, right? So the FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police have a big say in a lot of that. So I think, when we I'm not an expert on this, but I just know based on police departments that I work with and stuff like that, when you start thinking about the different trainings, because a lot of people are trying to get police on the street, right? The thing is everybody says they're understaffed. We need to make sure we have enough police to do the job. And I think when you look at there's different ways that people bring on people, right? Some say you can have a high school diploma and some 60 hours of college. Some ask for 4-year degree. So there's not a consistent across the board, across the country, of I can't even think of that, requirements to be a police officer, right? So I think each city and each jurisdiction has different ways to do it. And I think we had gotten caught up in this is the way it is the way it's always been, that we never went back and really looked at the training. So I think we're at a place now where people can actually start asking those kind of questions and looking at it. But I think a lot of it really is not just that the police might not want it. I think, the select few who actually participates in the FOPs are the ones who are pushing back on stuff. So I think you've got to think about all of that when you think about training. I know I can speak for Louisville. When we suggested certain trainers to our new chief, he would actually think about it and put them in place. And they actually took the 21st Century Police report that came out and really started taking it pillar by pillar and saying, what are we already doing? What are we not doing? And then how do we make those changes? But then again, that goes back to where are mayors' priorities and how are they saying to their chiefs, this is what I want done? Because at the end of the day, a chief cannot stay around if the mayor doesn't want him around. So I think mayors have a role to push, but I don't think mayors were being asked to look at police trainings for a while. I think when the movement started and people started asking those kind of questions, I think now you see cities taking a deeper dive into it. But I think they all just thought they were okay, right? We were here to do law and order. We didn't have to have all the other stuff that people are asking us to do now. But I think this movement and this moment has pushed cities to think about it differently. When we all might not have been asking those questions before, I just think now is the time for us to do that. And I think looking at all of the different stuff that's coming out with best practices and how this stuff can be done and how you can help have like more restorative police department. I think a lot of cities are taking it on, but I think you've got to still push for more to do it. So that would be my non-expert answer, that I think, it was just one of those things that we all just got stuck in a place where nobody was asking. And I think somebody said it earlier, we didn't have the words for implicit bias and all of those things. We knew they were happening. We just didn't know what needed to be done differently. But I think we're at a moment in a time that we can push for that.
Oh, I do want to share something, just a thought that I have, because I really want us to really think about this in a broad context, particularly around the narrative. There's a particular narrative that police are shooting people of color because they're not trained, that somehow there's a naivety, somehow there's a mistake. While I do believe that there's an issue around training, it's really remarkable to me that somehow there's restraint shown with people who are not Black folks. So I think we've got to really deal with that part of the narratives that I think, which is in defense of to not deal with the racial issue, and that there is a deeply seated value or lack of value for Black people. I think it's really important that somehow that when we're thinking about training, it's in a context that really is talking about having a deep analysis and a racial analysis through these departments. Because I also think that we have to be really careful that it does not get framed, that we don't respond in this way, that if the police just learn how to control their temper, if the police just go through this check, and oftentimes the police have demonstrated that when it comes based on there's a race factor that somehow training kicks in that doesn't kick in other instances. So I think it's really important that that we see beyond the narrative that this is an issue because police are not trained or that police are not prepared or they're overstressed. I think that certainly, I think those things come to play, but I do think that that larger, harder issues around how people of color and how Black people are perceived, seen, and the values and the principle of the policing system in this country, I think it's really important that we're looking at solutions in that frame as well.
Latasha, this is Nikichi. I agree 100% with you, 100%. What I found, however, is that if we need the police to hear what we're saying, if we need them to be receptive to even sit at the table, they completely turn off if they feel like we're telling it totally like it is. So we use words. I mean, I'm just saying, as opposed to outright blatant racism, so it's implicit bias. Okay, it's a lack of training, as opposed to what many of us feel the real situations are based on the whole historical legacy. So that's kind of like a dichotomy that kind of go back and forth in my mind, even in terms of this Baltimore report that came out from the DOJ. I mean, they brought the police to the table. They're at the table now, looking over some type of consent decree to remedy the problem. I guess there is a way in which we unfortunately have to do and say things so that it reaches a receptive ear. I mean, we know that in Baltimore, the DOJ found that the legacy of zero tolerance of street enforcement, along with deficient policies, deficient training, accountability, lack of accountability system, is what resulted in unconstitutional conduct by Baltimore police officers. But the way in which they had to say it and do it had to be a way in which the Baltimore Police Department, the unions and all, would be willing to come to the table and be part of the solution process. I don't know, it's just my 2 cents there.
Well, thank you so much.
Also add, go ahead, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I agree totally. That's what came out through our work, and as the South goes, words matter. So thank you so much.
And, and I just wanted to add to that, too, that leadership matters, too, right? Because that was Mayor Rollins saying, I want the DOJ to come in, even though I think, it was part of something that she had to do. But any police department and city can call the DOJ in today before they have a shooting and say, please review our policies, our procedures, and give us a feedback. And a lot of them just don't take them on until an incident happened, right? So I think if we can push mayors to say, and their police chiefs to say, we want this audit done now, so that we can understand where we are and where we need to change. And and I think you both are right. There's language that we need to use, but I also think at the end of the day, we all it matters around who's in the leadership role if things are going to change and how they're going to be different as well. So I just want to add that to it.
Thank you for adding that. And interestingly, on the Baltimore topic, actually, the new school chief, during her State of the Schools, she apparently took a very different tone to it, but including her administrators, urging her administrators to read the new Jim Crow to understand the real content of what they're up against, which I thought was quite interesting to hear about.
Yeah, love that.
Yeah. On that note, the next question is, what's the special role that youth leaders play in helping to create policies in cities, particularly policies that involve the role and authority of school police officers?
So I'll just jump in real quick. I think you gotta have them at the table. I think one of the things that we are real clear at Cities United, there's a number of voices that are important, but the most important voice, one of the most important voices for us, is our young people who are impacted by this violence on a day-to-day, right? So when you think about making policies and suggestions and thinking about trying to make young people's lives better, you've got to have them at the table helping you provide the solutions and guiding the conversation. So I think, one of the things Louisville is dealing with right now, we got these site-based decision-making teams outside of schools who get to make policies for that school. And I think one of the things is that you're supposed to have young people on there, but a lot of schools don't. and then they create policies that are more punitive than they are around being restorative and inclusive. So I think you've got to have young people on those, and when you think about the school level, but also community-wide, when you think about having police reform, you need young people having been a lead in that conversation. So I don't think we can do these community change or community movement building conversations without the young people helping to lead.
Thank you. Did anyone else have any thoughts on that topic?
I'm ditto.
You have reached the Open Society Foundations. If you know the extension of the party you'd like to reach, please dial it now. For the Open Society Personnel Directory, please press 9. For general information, please press 2. For grants management information, please press 3. For human resources information, please press 4. Please stay on the line for all other inquiries, and an operator will assist you.
Hello?
Thank you for calling the Open Society Foundations.
I think we may have lost one of our speakers. Hopefully everyone can hear.
One moment, please.
Oh. Did someone call OSI?
Society Foundations. How may I help you?
Hi, we may have lost one of your staff people on the phone, but you can hang up and we'll move forward. She should be able to dial back in.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
As it happens with technology, things do happen. So
I know.
Let's pose one other question to the group, and then we're going to open it up for some final thoughts and next steps.
Okay, Edward, I did want to just, since there are funders and we're on the phone, I do want, in recent years, we've seen a trend, particularly in the South, where youth organizing dollars have decreased. They've getting smaller and smaller, the pot for youth organizing and youth-led organizations. And I think, just kind of to the point made earlier, I think in terms of funders, we really should look at how we're supporting youth leadership in general and how we supporting the capacity building of youth-led organizations.
Perfect segue to this question, and welcome back, Nikichi.
Yeah, sorry.
One of the questions that did come up, it's actually two of them. One was as it relates to, if you all could cite some examples of organizations that would benefit, that funders should know about. If you could cite some examples at the national or some local examples of organizations that would be good to invest in and investigate in on the funders, for the funders.
Yes, I have a recommendation for an organization that many times funders don't know about and they don't really get funded. It's a long-standing organization, but it's not one of the traditional civil rights organizations. It's called the Institute of the Black World 21st Century, which has a number of different working groups. It has a drug policy reform working group. It has a law enforcement reform working group under the aegis of a former police officer, Ron Hampton, who used to be head of the National Black Police Association. But the reason why I mentioned them is that they have a key connection between the older generation, but connected with the younger youth Black Lives Matter generation. They're like a connective type tissue, I guess you could say. They're not jaded in terms of been there, done that, et cetera, et cetera. But they have a very proactive agenda, and the type of agenda that the younger generation would rally, would rally. But they have the discipline, they have the breadth of experience and the longevity, okay, in terms of being out there for decades, I guess you could say. So that's one organization. Again, the name is called the Institute of the Black World 21st Century, and they have a convening coming up in November after the elections called State of the Black World. And Alvin and Edward, I can send you the information around for that if any of the funders are interested in tapping into that.
Please share it.
I get email regularly. I appreciate you bringing that up. Someone else suggested the Baltimore Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Other thoughts, other suggestions anyone have?
Yeah, so this is Anthony, and I'm going to be kind of selfish as an organization who's always looking. I think folks should look at Cities United and figure out a way to help support us as we do our work with mayors across the country. And I think somebody mentioned youth organizers earlier, and I think that's so key to a lot of the work that we do. Folks on the ground who are organizing, who's moving and working in the community are not supported in the way that they need to be supported, and that's across the country. So you can find organizations in every city who are on the ground in community, have relationships, and trying to build out, but just don't have the proper resources. And I think if you think about, I don't know what kind of intake BYP 100 takes in, but I think they've got chapters across the country. They're a national youth-led organization, 18 to 35. But they have chapters all over. And then the last two, just because I'm connected to them heavily, that I would mention would be the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, and then Be Me.
Thank you.
I want to mention one other, if I can. It's not a specific group, but it's a constituency. It's a constituency of directly impacted people, particularly those who are formerly incarcerated. They are really moving and shaking. They are organizing. They are building. They're really coming into a movement of their own. They have mottos of nothing about us without us, all of us or none, etc. Because many times we sit around these large tables and we talk about strategies and we're the experts, but there's not anyone who's been directly impacted, meaning who has actually been through the system themselves as part of that process. So I just want to make sure that we don't forget about that constituency as well.
So
Thank you.
I have a couple of groups that I wanted to share. One at the top of my list was BYP 100, Youth Project 100. Also the Black Collective, they're out of Oakland. They're doing fantastic work. I think in terms of even training and preparing and addressing issues that impact youth, Black youth. There is the Ordinary People Society, which is led by formerly incarcerated people. It is in Dothan, Alabama. They have been doing some of the most profound, I think, reform work and engagement around issues around police brutality, over policing, sentencing, and it's led by Kenny Glasgow, Pastor Kenny Glasgow out of Dothan, Alabama. It's TOPS, the Ordinary People Society. There's also a fantastic organization in New Orleans, Families and Friends of Louisiana Incarcerated Children, that have been on the forefront of this issue and do fantastic work in the community. And then the other organization two other organizations that I raised is Project South, which is based in Atlanta, but they have built this fantastic network of youth organizations, not just youth organizations, but grassroots and social justice organization, and actually have convened a meeting called the Southern Movement Assembly, where they bring these Southern groups together from around the region. So Project South is another one, and the last one that I'll mention is an organization in Alabama called 21st Century Youth Leadership Movement. And the reason why I'm raising them, they work primarily with chapters of rural youth. And what winds up happening, the policing issue becomes in an urban context, and what you really see a lot of debtors courts and a lot of the lack of defense and other things, particularly in rural areas where they're concentrated Black youth. And this is an organization that works with Black rural youth.
Thank you. I'll also shed light for everyone on two other websites you should visit. MakingBlackLivesMatter.org, which Hill Snowden is running, Hill Snowden Foundation, which also contains a link to the Black Social Change Funders Network. There's some other organizations there that definitely you should take note of and learn more about. It's also being done, we're starting to do some additional work in a national listing that the New York Foundation has been pulling together that will be announced and shared very soon. And fundersforjustice.org is another website that is bringing together hundreds of funders now to really focus on these issues as it relates to criminalization and the criminal justice work. So you should definitely keep that in mind. We're going to run out of time in a few moments, so I wanted to invite Alvin and invite the panel to provide some final thoughts before we sign out. And thank you again for this participation.
Thank you. I don't even know what to say. Thank you so much, Edward. This conversation has been very full, and I think one thing that I'm walking away from is that the Black experience has always been one of intersectional oppressions. And I think it was well spoken throughout this conversation that unfortunately we can't just piece one element to really define a particular solution. So it really is holistic systemic change, and I'm very confident that the folks on this call will move this agenda forward. So I'm excited to actually rejoin the philanthropic sector momentarily. So I'm just going to stop there, but I do want to give more time to the panelists for their closing comments. And I guess I'll just start how we started off at the beginning. Latasha Brown, do you want to go first?
I will be brief. One, thank you. I thank you for ACT's leadership in pulling this conversation together. I think this is a conversation that we need to have. It is a difficult one, and I think it really requires us really put in the context of how do we deal with the structural issues that have perpetuated this system that has criminalized people of color, and that we really lead, oftentimes even in our own institutions, we have to lead those conversations and talking with each other and with our grantee groups. So I just want to thank you for this opportunity, this platform to really be able to share. I am open, like I said, with Grant Makers for Southern Progress, and we are in conversation with each other. We are a working group of funders, national and regional funders, and this is a core issue for us, criminal justice, and the impact that it has had on the region and the nation as well. So I just offer myself to be able to connect with others that are on the phone, and thank you all for this opportunity.
Nkechi?
Okay, great. Yes, again, I would like to also thank you all for this opportunity to share on this very, very critical issue. And for those who might not have a background, not just in terms of issues involving policing, but issues in terms of reentry or sentencing or racial justice, human rights, drug policy, commutations, I really invite you to visit our website that the Open Society Policy Center hosts on behalf of the Justice Roundtable, www.justiceroundtable.org. The Roundtable has been in existence since 2002, and I'm the founder of the Roundtable and convene it, and it brings together advocacy organizations, primarily who work on federal criminal justice policy reform. But we found the need to have a basic website that was not proprietary. It doesn't beef up any one particular organization, but all of the groups contribute, and anyone can be a part of it. So justiceroundtable.org. And I just want to conclude again by saying what we need to do is turn our mourning into movement, our MOURN, mourning into movement, and our sorrow into strategy. Thank you so much.
Anthony.
Yeah, again, I just want to echo the other two panelists and thanking you all for pulling this together and for actually and making sure that we were here and inviting us to be a part of it. We are, like I said, not a funder, but we work closely with funders, and I think this having a holistic conversation around how we get our work done is very important. And again, for me, just remembering that policing start way before we hit law enforcement, and how we think about what this looks like and how we move it forward is important. I think leadership matters, and not just that we have the right leadership, but that we hold our leadership accountable for their policies and the procedures, but then also how they spend our money, so how they allocate their budgets. And then also my last thing I would say is that, you all asked the question, I think making sure youth are leading this work, that they're at the table, and then if we go into spaces that they're not there, our job is to make sure that they are invited and that we invite them with us. So just making sure that we use our limited our access to our power to create space for other people to be a part of the conversation.
And Brandon, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Lastly, I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this group. I think that mostly I've seen how police violence and broader sense of institutional racism is not only oppressive in the sense that it disallows for us to maintain our health, both physical and psychological, but it is also pervasive in the sense that it disallows for building meaningful and intimate relationships with the people within our community. And so I'd also like to charge both this panel and the listeners that the way police violence and violence in general impacts us is much broader than the way we currently measure it, by which I mean the amount of people who are killed on a daily basis. So again, thanks a lot. I really appreciate this opportunity.
And again, for all of us, we want to give thanks to AbbVie for actually having the courage to really step up and have this conversation. It is an important one, it is an uncomfortable one, but it's probably the one that we need to have the most at this moment. So I want to thank everyone for coming out. Edward, do you have any final words?
I echo that appreciation to everyone, the panelists as well as the participants, for the richness. And we just want to encourage you to keep this conversation going. Several of you have already started identifying other organizations people should be aware of, encouraging you to shoot that information to me. You can use it in the social media as well. But we definitely want to make sure people are aware of just how we can not only continue this conversation, but also as we move from mourning to movement, and from this idea of it just becoming something that we lament about, that we really do come up with some solutions, and we do turn this sorrow into solutions. So thank you all. Again, stay in touch, and most importantly, stay active. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.